I'm Ellen Berry. I direct the center. And I'm very, very pleased to have Dr. Phil Dickinson with us today. He's from the English department, where he teaches courses in contemporary literature and culture. The fringier, the better, right? And speaking of fringy, today he will be presenting from his very long work that's been ongoing for many years, called Moveable Backdrop, but actually Mere Pseud is the real title. I think he will also be impersonating the Mere Pseud, right?
Yeah.
And with lots of help from the audiovisual community here. So I'm really excited to hear this extravaganza. So long in the making.
Get back with me at the end.
Yeah, you're So please join me in welcoming Dr. Phil Dickinson.
Okay, I guess I'm going to use the microphone. It's fortunately connected with a cord. So I'd like to thank Ellen and ICS for making it possible for me to take a semester off from my teaching duties to work on this project. It's an ongoing project. It's been going on basically my whole life and will probably continue for the rest of my life. But this particular iteration of it really has been going on since about 2008. I'd like to also thank my good friend Simon, who has really endured this project from the beginning and probably knows it as well as I do at this point. And also Caroline for videotaping this, and my friend Rob here for being the musical accompaniment. So my project is entitled, well, this talk is entitled Moveable Backdrop, which is a phrase from the lyrics of a post-punk performer by the name of Marquis Smith, who fronts a band that some of you may be familiar with called The Fall. He is now their only original member, having kicked out approximately 50 other band members over the course of the last 35 years. And the subtitle of my talk is From Mere Pseud to Mere Pseud, or It's About Time You Started Thinking About the Rerun, which seems to be our lives. So, would you like to begin?
Dance, Phil, dance.
Someone's always on my tracks. And in a dark room you see more than you think. I'm out of my place, got to get back. I sweated a lot, you could feel the violence. I've got shears pointed straight at my chest. And time moves slow when you count it. I'm better than them, and I think I'm the best. But I'll appear at midnight when the film's closed. 'Cause I'm in a trance. And I sweat. I don't want to dance. I want to go home. I couldn't live in those people places. If I get to know my actions, I'd run away from toilets and feces. I'd run away to a non-date on the street. 'Cause I'm in a trance. And I sweat. I don't want to dance. I want to go home. I feel trapped by mutual affection, and I don't know how to use freedom. I spend hours looking sideways to the time when I was 16, because I'm in a trance. And I sweat. I don't want to dance. I want to go home. I'm frightened. Incredibly frightened. It's about time you started thinking about the black dog on your back. Now it begins. Wednesday, March the 24th, 1971. A red pocket-sized, let schoolboy diary, a pencil, a black page, a blank page. Exhibit A in the ongoing witch trials. Evidence for the lifelong urge to document all of it. The whole spectacle, all the passing flux and flow of it. And some might even cite this as evidence of a darker, deeper curse that first showed itself when? Was I 6, 7, 8? I fell to counting the corners of my bedroom ceiling 100 times or more before I could allow myself to go to sleep. What horrors lurked there in my ordinary room? For those of you who know me well, this symptom is a familiar one that shows its daylight face, in my weird fetish for lists and list making of all kinds. Hexes to ward off who knows what. Perhaps this is why I've been an inveterate diarist and journal keeper my whole life. Well, at least since that Wednesday in March 1971, when I was just a few months shy of my 7th birthday. There's a shelf in my basement over there on Parker Street by the hospital, where I keep all the notebooks, the diaries, the teaching and research notes, the lists of hexes and X's, diagrams and indexes, theories and practices, koans, invocations, vows, dribblings, fragmentary studies, explications, commentaries, Marxisms, Buddhisms, obscurantisms, reams and reams devoted to arcane peripheral glimpses, mysteries hidden in plain sight. And I write and I write and I write and wonder what will happen to all those words, to these words. They do look quite impressive arrayed there on the shelf, but what they all add up to, who can say? Time moves slow when you count it. So, 1971. There's another diary fragment from 1977 when I was 13. And then another, longer one, this time, from the second half of 79. A record that degenerates quickly into lists of the major headline stories of the day. Crudely sketched fighter jets from World War II. Careful notations of how little money I had in my possession. Lists of weather conditions. Identifications of prevailing cloud formations, etc., etc. Just call me Rain Man. What precisely it was that prompted me to begin at that precise moment, I can't say now. But this much is clear in retrospect. Some impulse, something, was struggling to be born. On Sunday, June the 8th, 1980, he came into the world, the mere Pseud, although he would keep his presence secret for another 3 decades. It was a Sunday, sunny and calm, a suburban tableau of quiet gardens and bees and high contrails in the vaulted blue and frozen in place fair weather cumulus. It was the summer holidays, the summer of O-levels, those matriculation exams that mark the end of childhood for most English secondary school children. Today I got up around 10 o'clock, I wrote, in neat blue biro pen the evening of that first day, neatly underlining the day and the date in contrasting red ink. I had been going to get up for some time, but I kept drifting in and out of sleep. My pedestrian opening gambit wins no prizes for lyricism, and curiously echoes almost word for word that first entry from 9 years before. Awake from sleep, emerge into the light, into words, into the imagination. What I hope to discover, I'm not quite sure. I think I expected something like an eventual revelation. Expected that, if I drilled down deep enough into the grain and the texture of the ordinary, the words would knit together and I'd find a pearl, a pattern, that the warp and weft of wisdom might reveal itself to me, or be revealed for me. O foolish youth. Thus did the fleeting moments of the passing days and weeks of a rather ordinary English lower middle class life plod by one. Nothing much happened, but of course everything happened. Anxiety-ridden afternoons at the local comprehensive, fitful planning for the future, not much planning to be honest, sidelong fretting for a girl who never really gave me a second thought, a slow and awkward turning towards countercurrents in music, in politics, in art, in stuff I'd never even imagined existed. Half-secret rendezvous in abandoned places. Empty factories. Excuse me, I lost my place. Empty factories, weed-strewn post-industrial car parks and derelict shops, while the workaday traffic rumbled by. I stood at the threshold, at many thresholds, of lives lived in an imaginal realm, worlds opened up on walks, in books, on turntables, by friends. And of course, the life I lived for real, the obdurate material life of my privet-hedged everyday, was largely chosen for me by others, by my parents, by teachers, by the deep-rooted class formation of which I was a part, by the expectation that I succeed and do so in conventional, understandable terms, that I do well, be a success, pass my exams, and so on. It was all fairly easy looking back, fatally so in some respects. Man hands on misery to man, Philip Larkin tells us. Maybe so, but I was lucky enough to grow up with a family who loved me, in houses filled with books and music and conversation, with weekend walks in the Yorkshire Hill Country, amid horizons I suspect were a good bit wider and culturally more aspirational than those of the other kids I rubbed shoulders with at school. I remember my shock at visiting a mate's house and discovering his family apparently owned no books. How could that be? I started to write, words that eventually numbered 500,000, spread over 2,500 pages and 10 9x7 card-bound notebooks. But I wasn't a writer, not a real one anyway. I just kept a journal. But something had snaked its way up the cultural and chromosomal ladder, from a 19th century English working class sensibility that prized a certain kind of bookish education of which Matthew Arnold might be proud. A sensibility that even then was under siege by the hedonic distractions of an accelerating age. My maternal grandmother, whose formal education ended at 14 when she left school to go and work in the mills, was an avid reader all of her life, and in her late 70s wrote a 200-page account of her life in Edwardian and between the wars Bradford in the notebook I'd given her one Christmas. Closer to hand, perhaps, the impulse to write came from my father, policeman poet, himself a diary keeper and amateur writer, and my oldest brother Mick fancied himself a writer too. What strikes me now, looking back, is the compulsive diligence I exhibited in this day-in, day-out process, this epic struggle to record reality as it unfolded right under my nose, a compulsion, a need to write my way out of a narrowly defined vision of a life world that deepened like Larkin's coastal shelf, one bequeathed to me by parents who, bless them, at times found my nascent cultural and political imaginings a bit mystifying. The Jackson Pollock-esque paint spatters on my Adidas school bag were a little hard for my mother to understand. This, the woman who grew up lugging a gas mask to school, who endured poverty and the Depression and Luftwaffe bombing raids, and whose byline in my teenage years was, "It's smart to be smart," and who once, when I was a student in college, publicly disowned me in a Bradford street, so acutely embarrassed was she by my thrift store overcoat, combat pants and purple shoes. The witch trials, indeed. By the mid-80s, the entries in my journal started to become more infrequent. The cone of possibility seemed to shrink a little with each passing year. I wasn't a writer after all, just keeping a damn diary. Sometimes 2 weeks or a month would go by until guilt forced me back, desperately trying to remember the backlog of everything I'd missed. Eventually I gave up altogether. University done with, I moved back home, back to those people places I'd run away from, back to that claustrophobic sense of self I'd tried to write my way out of, back to a grim, apathetic year of self-loathing and unemployment, reinterred once more in the privet-lined family plot, while friends found jobs and lives and lovers. Desperate, I made a break for it. Took a train again to my college town to shack up with a friend and start over, only to return 2 days later, sheepish, hungover, with broken teeth earned on a drunken bicycle ride around a flower bed. London and a temp job in the city followed, as did love with my boss, oops. And then in 1988, I applied to graduate school in the United States. And one August afternoon washed up here at the Greyhound station on Lehman Avenue, in a leather jacket and Chelsea boots with a suitcase and a map of BG. Yes, I brought a map. It was a sultry 102 degrees. Miles Pizza Pub shimmered in the haze. I dodged the mediocrity and dull daily dose. I dodged the witch trials, or so I thought. I planned on going home after a year, but as they often do, the 1 year turned into 2, then 3, then 5. Women, wine, weirdness, the old story. The years slide by. 10, 15, 20, fuck, a quarter century now. Love, death, birth, heartache, the spinning sky. Teaching at the local university, a job I grew to love. Music, rudimentary beats, barroom mysteries. Marriage and a baby. A red-faced, black-eyed alien squirming beneath the heat lamp at the hospital. Fatherhood. Then separation and divorce. More heartache and joy. The baby, a spirited American girl now. Winter following spring, following summer, and then fall again. Inexorable seasons and semesters turning into a life. A second self grafted onto one that came before. Horizons of corn and houses and Midwestern strip malls. The sky an ocean of bright and stormy clouds. And all these years home, a mirage carried in the heart, while the roots of this new life grip down, awaken. A language of the stones, almost like a dream. The journals, wrapped in newspaper, languished in a box under the bed in my old room at my parents' house beneath the wet West Yorkshire sky. The mere Pseud waited, biding its time. One day I asked my mother to send them. They arrived in my mailbox one by one, wrapped now in brown paper. I think my mother had started to read one, was shocked and thought better of it. And while my daughter splashed in the local pool with her friends in the white light of a hot Ohio summer afternoon, I loitered in the shade, reading them again voraciously, drinking in the mouldy smell of the paper and feeling the ribbed pen scratches beneath my fingertips, transporting me back almost 30 years to a life once lived and now captured, a fragile yet perfect facsimile by the very words whose imperfections I once had cursed. After 3 decades, some of the books were beginning to fall apart, the flimsy cardboard spines separating from the binding, the covers flapping like broken wings. I wanted to preserve them, so typed them up, and this tedious process was made lighter by a whimsical decision to turn them into a blog. I called it Mere Pseud, after a song by the English post-punk band The Fall, whose music I love and which evokes for me the stain of a very particular place at a very particular time. The phrase Mere Pseud itself captures perfectly, for me at least, the way the almost debilitating self-consciousness of my younger self wraps together both the crushingly ordinary and the ineffably extraordinary experiences of simply being alive day to day. I posted each entry 28 years to the day after it was written, and as both June the 8th, 1980 and June the 8th, 2008 fell on the same days of the week, so the events in Mere Pseud started to unspool in real time again. Over the course over the course of 4+ years of ordinary and not so ordinary days. Each of these two worlds, mine and that of the mere Pseud, haunted by the ghosts of the other's futures and pasts. I fictionalized both names and places, and in a few instances rendered separate people as composites. Thus was Easterby born, a fictional place lived in by a cast of fictional characters, made somehow more real by their distance from the memory of a period I'd lived through in miseries of self-consciously quiet desperation, a memory increasingly replaced by the golden-hued hauntological fiction that became mere Pseud. I've really got to figure out a better method here, right? A dream record as though drawn from someone else's memory rather than my own. I said, it's about time you started thinking about the rerun, which is your life. Moveable Backdrop. Sunday, April 27th, 2014. Who knows where the threads lead if traced back, twisting and looping through years and experiences and family and friends, and back to cradle days and mother's arms. Philip, the third child, the accident, the favoured one, the babe on whom was lavished the relaxed plenitude of a middle-class comfort denied the first two, closer in age who'd faced poverty, council estate living, hard streets and mucking about, a collectivist childhood recollected through black and white TV snow. Not for them the idyllic singular childhood cul-de-sac of dreams and dog and colour television and sunset green trees and mysteries over the wall and sex games with the neighbour girl and boy, fantasies, dinosaurs, space, the stars, galaxy.
Those there to suspect would not see the wood for the trees. We were sex-like guys, but we're back to flies.
Up here in the north, there are no wage packet jobs for us, thank Christ. While young married couples discuss the poverties of their self-built traps, and the junior clergy demand more cash, they spit in their plates and wait for the ice to melt. I must create a new regime, or live by another man's. Before the moon falls. Before the moon falls. Must create a new scheme. Get out of others' hands. Before the moon falls. In the summer of 2010, in an effort to promote this project, I sent out a few exploratory emails to various online venues, blogs and websites mainly, sites that belong to a peculiarly widespread genre of cultural remixers and jammers who showcase their obscurantist and obsessively insiderish knowledge of British pop culture weirdness and arcana from the 70s and 80s. And their devotion to what the authors of the blog The Pseudo-Scientific World of Tom Tit, it's a Doctor Who reference by the way, call, quote, strange connections and pseudo-scientific rubbish, end of quote. One such blog, Toys and Techniques, run by Ben Graves, reviewed mere Pseud thus, quote, not quite clear whether this is an actual record of an actual life or an elaborate, serialized, hauntological fiction, end of quote. Hauntology. Some of you might recognize this reference to Derrida's Spectres of Marx, and the adjectival form of the noun has, in the past decade or so at least, been widely used to acknowledge the pervasive feeling that we are living through what Mark Fisher calls the slow cancellation of the future, an era of cultural inertia hidden behind the superficialities of technological innovation and newness. This sense that time is jumbled up, that the past is montaged into the present in ways that have ceased to be worthy of comment, are the symptoms of what Frederick Jameson calls the cultural logic of late capitalism and its exhaustion of alternative futures, its odd inability to find forms adequate to the present. The futures we imagined possible are possible no more, exhausted. So we raid our collective past, cannibalize it, strip it bare, a sort of zombie supercut, a retromaniac remix. The past keeps coming back, says Fisher, because the present cannot be remembered. Now, the availability of constant low-level stim precludes the sorts of productive alienation and boredom that Fisher speculates led to punk culture in the 1970s. Little wonder that we are awash in memory disorders. Little wonder that the rapid shifts and cuts of the digital mediascape function as a kind of anti-memory. Little wonder we are stalked by vampires and the Walking Dead, by zombie fundamentalisms. Our shared delusions become an adaptive form of forgetting, a way of consenting to the toxic verities of a historical moment that leaves us all unmoored and unsettled, but always entertained. Moveable backdrop. The backdrop shifted and changed, shifted and changed. Monday, June the 9th, 1980. I had my physics exam at 9. I was a bit nervous. Some of the questions were really hard and I made some amazing cock-ups. 2.4 times 50 equals 100. I could hardly do any of the questions on electricity. And when I got home, I felt really frustrated and angry with myself. I should have done more revision. I spent the rest of the day watching cricket. Dad is in a stinking mood, fed up because he's been told to work his days off, and is again going on about yobos, saying, I don't agree with handouts of the NHS, a bit of hardship is a good thing, and all the usual when I was a lad type stuff. Mum says she doesn't wish her childhood on anyone and has just stormed out. Thursday, June the 12th, 1980. I had powdered packet soup for lunch. It's really amazing how just adding water to a dry grey powder can produce lumps of meat. It was pretty sickening though, so I chucked half of it away. I watched England play Belgium on the telly, and although everyone was pretty confident of an England victory, it ended up a crummy 1-1 draw. There was a huge riot among the English fans near half-time, and the Belgian police used tear gas to disperse the crowds. The game was stopped for a few minutes because the players' eyes were watering from the gas. It was all a bit pathetic. Robert showed up at midnight looking really tired. He was broke and told us that recently someone tried to nick his van from outside a pub by crossing the wires to the ignition. All his wiring had burned out, and the garage mechanic said his car would have blown up if he'd switched the lights on. Thursday, June the 19th, 1980. I'm fired up with enthusiasm over Marxism, and a lot of what Marx said seems like pure common sense. Every man equal, total egalitarianism, a classless society, and so on. Today I've been reading about class struggle and his theory that it's only groups, not great men, who affect the course of history. According to Marx, Dad is a bourgeois lackey, a proletarian who betrays the interests of his own class by implementing a law which benefit the bourgeois. I wonder how he'd react to that. Next scene. The grassy dale and lowland scene. Come see, come hear the English scheme. The lower class want brass, bad chests, strange fags. The clever ones tend to emigrate. Like your psychotic big brother who left home for jobs in Holland, Munich Road. He's thick, but he's struck it rich. Switch, the commune crap, camp, bop, middle class, flip-flop. Guess that's why they end up in bands. For Mark Fisher, the regime of what he calls capitalist realism hides its contradictions, horrors, and inequities beneath a facade of what he calls imbecilic slogans no one, neither the people who wrote them nor those at whom they are aimed, believes. We are denied all but the fantasy of believing a different future, which reminds us, if we're still able to remember, of Margaret Thatcher's infamous rejoinder that there is no alternative. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But we're awash with spectral reminders of these lost alternatives, nonetheless. Spectres whose ghostly voices remind us that we can't give up entirely on what once was but can no longer be. Hauntology, at least the version of hauntology that Fisher mobilizes, is a resistant, stubborn formation. These ghosts won't give up. They demand their due. One such spectral trace Fisher terms popular modernism, and it's as good a term as any to capture the contradictory mood of an early 80s moment that serves as one of the many moving backdrops for the events in Pseud, and which, even then, was slowly shuffling off stage right. The English early 1980s was the twilight era for a particular kind of post-war social democracy, now long gone, one of broad consensus with regards to the virtues of a well-funded welfare state and social and political restraints on the more rapacious effects of capital, a society that expected an engaged and activist ethos of public administration. Fisher lists the music press and the more challenging parts of public service broadcasting, as well as post-punk, Penguin paperbacks and the BBC Radiophonic Workshop as exemplars. And this is what makes the Pseud of the journals fully a teenage modernist. He's invested in ways in which he'd probably be embarrassed to admit in popular modernism's retrospective vindication of the high modernist project, the redemptive power of art and ideas, the documentaries he loved to watch about the ancient Greeks, apartheid in South Africa, US hegemony in the Caribbean, the Irish War, not to mention the late-night foreign films with subtitles in which, if he was lucky, the Pseud might glimpse a breast or a buttock. The techniques of the broader modernist project of cultural renewal were collectively reworked and extended, disseminated and popularized in ways that opened up working class inventiveness in a way that is now scarcely imaginable, and that's a quote from Fisher. Thatcher swept most of this away and replaced it with a sort of middlebrow culture of low expectations, of mediocrity and populist pleasure, all breast and buttock, but no history. These spectres, writes Fisher, the spectres of lost futures, reproach the formal nostalgia of the capitalist realist world. It's about time you started thinking about the black dog on your back. It's about time you started thinking about the void, which is your life. Tuesday, February the 17th, 1981. I watched the 9 o'clock news with Mum. The miners are on strike over pit closures. And after Dad got home at 10, we all watched Ireland, a television history, which was about the civil rights demos of 1969. They showed a clip of riot-equipped soldiers with huge truncheons clubbing someone to the ground in the aftermath of the murder of 3 British soldiers. I said there was no excuse for acting like that, and soon Dad and I were exchanging violent words. Bloody predictably, he made excuses and said it was sickening what they did to those soldiers. I agreed, but said that the British Army dragged itself down to the IRA's level by doing things like that, at which he got really heated and told me that sometimes as a policeman in Easterby, he's had to hit people on the back of the head with a truncheon. You've got a lot to learn. I'll never accept that sort of behaviour as the norm, he snapped, and angrily switched the television off. I came to bed. Saturday, March the 7th, 1981. Robert brought me some tea before he and Carol set off for his school football match. It was freezing and I sat by the fire reading about the medieval monarchs of England until Robert and Carol came back. Bacon sarnies for lunch, and then Robert and I set off for the match. We got to Wettonstone Road halfway through the first half. The athletic supporters were caged up at one end of the ground and for the most part showed little enthusiasm for the match, which was a typical mid-table slog of hoofballs and plenty of whistle. We were locked behind a big iron gate supervised by 2 loutish officials in bright green waistcoats. During the second half, these craggy-faced morons and their loud-mouthed pig friends started shouting and swearing at us, spitting and gesturing at one Pakistani lad in particular. The police stood benignly at the back, smiling and talking. I felt angry. 10 minutes from time, Elmfield scored with a jammy header that sneaked between Ackroyd and the post. After the game, a few of the athletic thugs stole a flag and we were locked in our cage. No flag, no home, until it was handed back. Records and telly all evening. Friday, March the 20th, 1981. After English, we watched The War Game, the 1963 shock film banned by the BBC. Despite its age, it's effective, and as I watched, I felt a knot of anticipation in my stomach. Some of the scenes were upsetting, and a few of the girls cried in the toilets afterwards. Otherwise, the day passed swiftly. History notes and fusillades of mindless criticism from Angela Reed, delivered without conviction. Amazingly childish. Claire invited me to a jumble sale at Beatrice Hall and tea at her house afterwards. We got to the jumble sale at 6. I bought a dilapidated tennis racket for 5 pence, and after tea we did the washing up. But she so obviously had other things on her mind. Michael was taking her to the Adelphi later. She washed her hair while I finished the pots, and at 7:30 Michael arrived looking suave in jacket and tie, and they left shortly after. I stayed behind and played snooker with her little sister. I felt so second best. The evil is not in extremes, it's in the aftermath, the middle mass. After the fact, vulturous in the aftermath. The early 80s era spanned by mere Pseud record an ordinary life unfolding within a time of crisis and political reinvention for British society. The period roughly bookended by the election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government in 1979 and that of Tony Blair's New Labour in 1997 marks a turning point for British society and much of the Western world in general. The post-war class compromise between capital and labour began to unravel for reasons too complex to go into here, to be replaced by an ideology that celebrated instead a populist libertarianism and elevated a consumerist identity, politics and self-realisation through shopping into something approaching an art form. This is the period that marks the onset of neoliberalism, the pernicious notion that, as David Harvey puts it, quote, human well-being can best be advanced by liberating individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills within an institutional framework characterised by strong private property rights, free markets and free trade, end of quote. I don't usually talk this much. This neoliberal vision of a constellation of free yet atomised individuals, each pursuing their marketised neoliberal due, rendered obsolete the long-standing post-war acknowledgement of a collective common good. Then, as now, the pseudo-satisfactions of neoliberal consumer choice and freedom masked the grim contradictions of a social body, increasingly rent by inequality, austerity, and a wider assault on the fortunes of labour, of working people and the poor. The mere Pseud was not immune. As I reread, transcribed and revised these entries, I was struck by the degree to which his adolescent dissatisfactions were sublimated through acts of aimless consumption, of clothing, of records, of books, of posters. He is forever catching the bus into town to trail through the brutalist precincts and plazas to look for, well, something to buy, I suppose. The backdrop shifted and changed. Saturday, May the 16th, 1981. Got up at 11 and Dad ran me into Easterby, where I was supposed to be meeting Lee again at 1:30. I waited for a full 30 minutes at the library before going to look around Smith's and eventually bought some trousers in Eastgate, really tight blue ones. I can't make up my mind about them. I also bought 10 polythene LP covers and a book celebrating the 100th FA Cup final. As you can no doubt tell from the general lethargy and dullness of the last few entries, I'm really sickened off with life. Friday, June 26th, 1981. Woke up at 9 and at 11:30 I trudged reluctantly down to school. Felt depressed and fed up today for some reason. Intermittent rain. I lost 4-6, 4-6, 7-6, 0-6 in a 3-hour tennis game with Jeremy. Got back at 3 and during tea time I got embroiled in an argument with Mum and Dad over crime. I suppose I am siding with the criminals. I don't see it like that and really ended up doubting my entire belief system. Socialism. Does it go against the grain of human nature, as George Gale claims? And George Gale was a columnist in the Daily Express, which was a right-wing newspaper. I always think not, but then I could just be repeating a load of utopian rhetoric because I feel I ought to. I don't really know what I believe. I was plunged into self-piteous silence for the evening and never stopped looking at the black side of things. My failure to invite everyone over, have I snubbed Claire? My dilemma about what to wear, my doubts about my ideals. But now it all sounds so childishly heartrending that I'm embarrassed. But these things bother me, I can't deny them. I tried my new boots on with my blue trousers. Thought I felt silly but wasn't sure. Monday, January the 18th, 1982. At 6:20 I set off to see Grant and Friends Poetry, Music and Art performance. On the door were two blokes, short hair, fur coats, earrings. I gave them my 50p and blundered upstairs. I walked along a corridor between the wall and a big canvas screen which surrounded the stage and seats and bumped into Grant, who was wearing faded flared jeans, an old jacket and a college scarf. Nick was there too, tight black trousers, black shirt, thick spiky hair stuck out on top. Inside was a tangle of amps, guitars, cables, pedals and quite a few people. Audience-wise, there was around 5 people there to begin with, yet at times, with some participants non-participating, it swelled to a dozen or more. Hung behind the stage was a long rectangular sheet with what I presume is one of their action paintings, smeared and splashed across it. 3 more hung vertically to the side. All was informal, chaotic. The lights dimmed and it all began. First was Grant reading some of his poetry unaccompanied, sounding not unlike John Cooper Clarke. I suppose all such poets must sound like him. Speaking very close to the mic, almost blowing on it, sometimes stumbling over the words. The poems, well, although I couldn't hear all the words, what I could impressed me. They were all short and only took 5 minutes or so. Later on the phone, when I got home, he confessed to being really nervous. I admire him for having the guts to do something publicly. The action swung on. Next was the band Dazed Loaf. His heart organ was where it should be. His brain was in his arse. His hand was well out of his pocket. His psyche's in the hearth. I've organised Pseud into 7 sections, which I hesitate to call chapters, simply because the logic of their arrangement is dictated less by the internal thematic trajectory of each section, as it is the retrospective historical markup provided by the release date of the Fall's first handful of recordings. For the completists among you, that's their 2nd through the 8th album. But that said, I've quickly discovered there's an odd sort of synchronicity between these album titles, the lyrical content of their songs, and the respective section of my journals each one frames. So, for example, album number 5, Room to Live, which was released in September 1982, a few days before the Pseud, Room to Live, get it, went to college, and the lyrics of the album's 3rd song, Hard Life in Country, echo the Pseud's claustrophobic sense at that time, about to depart the childhood home for pastures new as he was, that his circumstances were cramped, confining, and a bit dull. I love the music of The Fall, and although they've gone on to release dozens of albums and singles, becoming in the process something of an institution in their own right, it's the output of their early years, up through the mid-1980s, that I love most of all. The Fall is a Manchester-based band, often casually labelled post-punk, although the term barely does them justice. Post-punk emerged in the period following punk's spectacular collapse into cliché and irrelevance, and which roughly corresponds with the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979. It's turned into something of a catch-all term for a whole slew of hybrid bands and styles that opened up what Simon Reynolds calls a space of possibility for a different kind of response to the boredom and contradictions engendered by Thatcher's neoliberal makeover of British culture than that offered by the original generation of British punk bands like the Sex Pistols. Post-punk bands were a bit more thoughtful, a bit less fuck you, a bit more willing to entertain tradition rather than just spit on it outright. The Fall belonged to the generation that spawned Joy Division and the factory records scene that made Manchester famous and served as the backdrop for post-punk heritage industry artifacts like Michael Winterbottom's 2002 film 24 Hour to Party People. Fronted by Marquis Smith, minor poet and sharp critic of hypocrisy, who is now the only original surviving member, The Fall exude a sort of primal and quintessential working-class defiance of middle-class piety and heritage industry platitude that's rooted in place in the streets, pubs and post-industrial landscapes of the late 1970s English North. The Fall of the early 1980s sound like no other band on earth. Writing of their 1980 album Grotesque after the Gram, Fisher describes their, quote, seemingly impossible combination of the shambolic and the disciplined, the cerebral literary and the idiot physical, end of quote. But it's Smith's lyrics, inventive, surreal, and just plain weird, that garner most of the attention. They evoke what music critic Michael Goddard calls a particular form of urban gothic, a weird realm where contradictory realities struggle for dominance over the pubs and car parks of windswept northern towns, huddled beneath grim hills and even grimmer skies. A fan of the weird and occult fiction penned by literary mavericks such as Arthur Machen, M.R. James, and H.P. Lovecraft, Smith's vision depends upon the difference between two reality systems, between the local consensus hallucination we dignify with the term reality and this other world, a far weirder space. The middlebrow world, the world we customarily live in, is the world of the witch trials, and Mark Fisher, writing of Smith's lyrical vision, wonders if witch trials themselves don't perhaps serve as a kind of metaphorical repeating structure, which is always excluding and denigrating the weird. Fisher calls Smith a pulp modernist, and argues that his vision depends upon a technique that collages together pieces that don't really seem to fit together. Listen to a song like NWRA, which stands for The North Will Rise Again, off Grotesque, and you'll hear precisely what he means. This pulp modernist methodology privileges intertextuality and a consistency of vision across different textual planes and registers, in the process elevating its fictional system against the author god of consensus reality. The backdrop shifted and changed. Movable backdrop, movable backdrop. The backdrop shifted and drifted. Wednesday, March the 17th, 1982. It was £2 to get in, and we were quite impressed with the place inside. Main hall with raised stage, bar, and the Fall already doing a sound check. Only a few people sat quietly about. Through the back, another smaller room where rastas wandered to and fro with piles of records, checking turntables and speakers, all the while reggae pounding out. The Fall came on late. The expected loud, piercing drums, guitars, keyboards. I wasn't really a fan at this point, actually. Wall of distorted noise with vocalists shouting inaudibly. Grant looked engrossed, bobbing away, while I stood there, not really hooked. A couple of their numbers were good, Just Step Sideways was the best. I recognised two craggy-faced, old-suited, shaven heads who I remembered seeing at the Pig Bag concert. Pig Bag, remember those guys? The Fall went on for ages and did a few encores before everyone flooded out, my ears ringing in the cold night silence. I walked home through gloomy orange-lit fog, part of the way with Nick, Grant, and a short-haired lad who's bassist for the day's loaf. Them talking, me silent, alone. I have a basic communication problem. Sunday, July the 4th, 1982. Grant and I went for a long walk in the grey gloom and rain along the canal to Brogden Woodlocks and up through the woods to Moxthorpe Commons, a light mist shroud of drizzle over everything. Then onto the moors above. Despite the damp, the views were tremendous. The onrushing sheets of rain, a bright white sky, the fields silver and dark as the light caught them. A 360-degree panorama of houses, factories, schools, streets, cars and greenery levelled low by distance to blend and lie with a roll of hills. To our backs, a black, ominous horizon line of distant moors. Easterby front right, tower blocks distinct and separate from the indiscernible muddle of low hills. The weather was wild and grey and desolate. We got bogged down on our way back, tramping through oceans of waving bracken and squelching green rushes and moss, and Grant fell into a tired, dried-up quiet, barely communicating, apart from the occasional grunt or word. As we reached the woods beyond Brogden Woodlocks, the weather cleared at last, and we were treated to sun streaming between dark tree trunks, glittering bright on the riverbed. Back up to Egley amid cemetery stones for tea and records and long quiet moments, vague arrangements for the future, before Grant left, borrowing Desolation Angels.
Yeah, it's like it's a bit sort of reading, reading sort of. Yeah.
in the present state of things, your body gets pulled right back. You get a terrible urge to drink. At 3 a.m., the stick people recede. The locals get up your nose, and leather soles stick on cobblestones. It's hard to live in the country. It has a delicate ring. Nymphet new romantics come over the hill. It gets a bit depressing. As a psychic formation, neoliberalism renders the imaginal realm inert, a flattened vista of homogeneous consumer choices. The instability of rapid accumulation engenders a conservative culture of stunted imaginations, dwarfed by the mirage of endless choice that's really no choice at all, and the illusion of a freedom that can only be imagined in market terms. 1,000 brands of bread that all taste the same. This is the culture that Thatcherism encouraged, that worldwide demands austerity and the common sense path to financial health, what Richard Witts characterises as the assertive urban consumption economy, one which measures prosperity by possessions. Pulp modernism is the antithesis of a social realism whose cultural ordinariness betrays an atrophied imagination of low expectations. Pulp modernism's intertextual fragments assert a different kind of possibility. In the second half of Mere Pseud, I rely on an intertextual strategy I won't presume to call pulp modernist, but it does bring together disparate characters who otherwise might not belong together. In October 1982, the Mere Pseud sets off for a new life as a student at the South Coast University of Watermail, which also happens to be the setting for Malcolm Bradbury's 1976 campus novel, The History Man. The History Man follows the fortunes of radical sociology professor Dr. Howard Kirk, and he makes a cameo appearance in Mere Pseud. By the time of Kirk's brief reappearance in the pages of Mere Pseud, his radical days are long behind him, and he's enthusiastically embraced the New World Order ushered in by Thatcher. The Mere Pseud spends his first year at university in residence hall. A few doors down lives Rowan Morrison. My favourite part. The very same Rowan Morrison who lures the unsuspecting PC Neil Howie to his death at the hands of the Celtic pagans of Summerisle in Robin Hardy's camp but genuinely terrifying classic 1973 British horror film, The Wicker Man. By the time of Mere Pseud, Rowan is a disturbed 22-year-old with a rather active sexual imagination. I said to them, it's about time you started thinking about the black dog on your back. I said, it's about time you started thinking about the rerun, which seems to be your lives. Monday, November the 8th, 1982. Last night as we sat in the kitchen watching Walkabout on a tiny portable TV, Shelley started playing with a knife and dragging it idly, speculatively across her wrists. Barry turned out all the lights because it was embarrassing to sit there watching her. We couldn't exactly take the knife off her. After a while, she rose silently and went into the other half of the kitchen where she stayed a long, long time and then stole darkly from the room. Lindsay went after her and Penny. Then, when I was just getting settled for the evening in Barry's room, a knock came at the door and there stood Rowan, saying she had done something. My heart sank. I discovered she'd thrown all her bedclothes and things from the wardrobe onto the floor and slashed a pillow with her knife, hurling feathers everywhere. She had, she told me, spent an hour crying to herself before exploding in a fit of rage and frustration. She'd written out the Lord's Prayer and twice said it out loud and backwards and then put a curse on someone, but she wouldn't tell me who. When she'd done this, she claimed, a gust of wind had rushed through the room. I felt like running away and hiding, but there was no one else to ask for help. Everyone else was out of their minds on hash oil or asleep, and no adults were available anywhere. What could I do? I was frightened of her dark looks and strangeness, frightened of her curses and those horrific cat posters on her walls, frightened of that weird, cluttered, oppressive room. I talked to her and tried to help her clean up as she laughed for a long time and spoke of her paranoia and insecurity. Dawn was so welcome. Thursday, January the 14th, 1983. Today's tutorial with Alan Draper was off-putting. A pathetic group, including a girl with a nasal foghorn voice, who droned on and on about the difficulty of getting books. We're finding it impossible, etc. And a North Country lad who said the word dawdle, which Draper didn't understand, so the kid apologised for his provincial ways. Someone else stuck up his hand and asked if he could go get a drink and returned with a can of Coke and a cheese roll. Draper's eyebrows raised in disbelief. Foghorn Girl slumped further and further into her seat. Her leg dangled wearily over the arm of the chair and adopted a pained, bored expression, and even glanced at her watch. "Thanks a lot," said Draper. "I have no enthusiasm for the future." In the afternoon, Pete and I went along with Barry and Lindsay to their sociology lecture to hear Dr. Howard Kirk on positivism and idealism. Incomprehensible. However, it did give me the idea that attending lectures unrelated to my courses is a good idea. Earlier in the day, Barry went to a lecture on the theory of capital as part of his own self-imposed study of Marxism. He aims for 100 pages a day, starting off with the German ideology. There's no ideology or structure which satisfies me. They all leave me with a disquieting feeling that there's something missing. Man whose head, A, knew about Politburo facade behind Kicker. C, who stole Kathleen's collection box. B, who applied cut-up technique literally to himself. E, who wore a red scarf to remind him of his fiancée. G, and visitor, esoteric, Japanese, says analyzer, Mr. Alistair touched off the tragedy. There is a quality of drift to Pseud, a magical and elusive quality, an aesthetic impulse that takes inspiration from concrete expressions and real environments. There's a strangeness there too, an everyday sort of strangeness that doesn't just default into knee-jerk exoticism, but instead catches a sideways glimpse of something ordinary, something mundane, a sort of quotidian slant captured by a certain angle of light, a momentary arrangement, a juxtaposition noticed in passing. The occult is not in Egypt, but in the pubs on your doorstep, basically, says Marquis Smith. It's hard to explain because, after all, our words are barely up to the task. Who can put their finger on the weird, asks Mark Fisher. Who indeed? Not me, that's for sure. And certainly not the Pseud, although he spent plenty of time trying. What's needed is a sideways step that we might call psychogeography, a slantways drift through physical environments and states of mind that catch the ordinary everyday magic left behind after the shops have closed, the bars emptied, the presents unwrapped, left in plain sight, undisturbed by those who know where they're going, have places to be. The medieval philosophers had a name for something similar, haixeity, a thisness, rather than a whatness. Different, the same. As a term, psychogeography, said situationist Guy Debord back in the 1950s, betrays a certain pleasing vagueness. And it's this approximation that best conveys what I'm talking about, what Pseud and the Pseud himself, at its best, captures and lays bare, a pleasing vagueness. But yet undeniably concrete, this. It's bloody annoying, I suppose, too, depending on your perspective. After all, the line between magic and mystery and that dull sense of not this shit again is a very thin line indeed. Sunday, December 11th, 1983. Bitterly cold. It was the cold that woke me up and eventually forced me out of bed. Everyone was scurrying about, cursing the freezing temperatures and trying to warm themselves on electric fires. In the afternoon, Dell took Barry, Pete and I out in his car for something to eat. He treated us each to a meal of mixed grill and prawn cocktail with ice cream and fruit salad for dessert. He owes the bank £400 and has been told he must not on any account write out another cheque. So between the four of us we totted up a £13 bill and Del paid with another cheque. There was some hassle over the cheque and the ageing Greek waitress's servile smiles and service suddenly vanished. So much for Christmas spirit. More and more I smell the stench of hypocrisy and greed at Christmas. It's just one huge capitalist con trick. We left feeling full, piled into Dell's Hillman Imp, and he took us on a tour of Noilden and Woodside, where he spent the first 9 years of his life. Noilden's narrow, winding streets and picture book facades look worthy of exploration. There's a squat, ancient church there, says Dell, and it's linked with witchcraft at certain times of the year. It was a journey back through time for him as he was seeing these streets and schools of childhood and infancy for the first time in 14 years. He got very quiet and sober, and we could tell that the nostalgia of the moment had got to him. It's odd how the salient memories of those concerned with death and tragedy, he said. The turn-off where Cilla Black's niece was knocked down and killed. The stretch of road where a hunchback Hell's Angel and companion collided head-on with a car while overtaking the bus. The Ryvita factory on the hill in which a man was beheaded on his very first morning of work as he scooped out to clean a machine. These incidents and memories map out Dell's childhood, just as for us all. There was something magical about the drive, the deepening dusk, the blue and pale world fluxed in declining light. Yeah, I actually used that phrase, I don't know where I got it from. Something about the succession of street corners and pavements streaming past the car window, unthought of places next to lamp posts and shop windows, all terribly alone and separate somehow, fragments of lives forgotten and never mattering to anyone anywhere, so much desolation and striving, words just marks on a page. These things dwarf me. I'm lost for descriptions, and none of it can ever be fully conveyed or captured by these cold constructions in ink. I don't think in words and find it difficult to make them yield their meaning, but whatever their inaccuracy and shortcomings, I have to try, and have tried. These pages bear witness to that effort. Maybe Nietzsche is right, and that history is one long retreat into nihilism, into unbelief, and into blind struggle. That maybe we have to save ourselves from these numbing conclusions and useless thoughts, but not by becoming blind again, but by some other step, maybe into acceptance. But for me right now, these are just so many words. And I feel them in the abstract, if I feel them at all. One day, perhaps. Pete wonders if when we're old, we'll look back and hate ourselves because of how little we've achieved. Maybe we'll wake up in our late 40s, married with children and a home maybe, a lifetime of memories behind us. As soon as we got back, Lee was walking up the road to greet us in unrestrained, festive mood, and I plunged back again into the present. Moveable backdrop. Moveable backdrop. Okay. The last section, I don't unfortunately have a CD for this. I guess, well, let me try and do this. Just bear with me a second. Blood on the sand, blood all around, tracks of the ride of the bright murder hawk. The day the dream debased and went home. And the people who knelt to those adrenaline rails, and everything stopped. The backdrop shifted and changed. Saturday, October the 27th, 1984. No work, trouble with the cops. Last Saturday night, about 10:30 in the evening, I dropped 2.5 tabs of acid with Lee and Stu. Basically, I fucked up. To begin with, it was wonderful. I knelt on the floor before Stu's hi-fi, hands extended in front of me like some new apostle as the music caressed me into near orgasm. Paroxysms of delight, unbearable ecstasy, sounds becoming shapes and coloured lights melting away in my mind. Real revelatory stuff. I thought I'd found the answer, found it. It was just so easy, I couldn't come to terms with it. And I kept asking Stu and Lee how we'd been mistaken all these years into deceiving ourselves that this wasn't the way ahead. It was so easy. Just swallow a piece of paper and there was heaven on earth. I knew at that moment that I tasted the ultimate in sensory pleasure, and I could have died fulfilled, knowing I had had it all. I knew everything. But as I was lying on Stu's bed on his big blue duvet, I ruthlessly tried to suppress a seed of doubt that grew in the very core of my being until I couldn't hold it back any longer. Already I was a long, long way from Stu and Lee. I sat up and told them, I'm going to die. Lee tittered. It must have sounded so ridiculous. But the more I tried to fight it, the worse it got, and a line of thought raced away into the infinite until I was holding on for dear life. I knew if I let go, that would be it. I couldn't sense my body at all, and as I felt for my pulse, there was nothing there. I was as good as dead. If I stopped breathing, then my heart would stop too. I started to panic and threw things around, screaming at the misery of my self-inflicted torture, insisting that Lindsay and her brother Ed, who was down for the weekend, be woken up, and that I be driven to the hospital in the latter's car. I must hold on, I kept telling myself as I lay on my back in the car, my head in Lindsay's lap, everything fragmented. I can only remember the journey through foreign and unfamiliar streets as a series of suffocating images. The car stopped at traffic lights, Ed asking, scared now, if he should run them, me in back shouting, yes, yes! I braced my feet against the window about to expire. We found Watermouth General, but it was deserted at this hour, so I ran around in a panic. I tore off my shirt in my fear, pounding at my chest to restart my heart. The caretaker called the police. On the way to Wessex County, we got lost and stopped to phone for directions, and here the police picked us up. And at the hospital, I remember the freezing walk across the car park in stocking feet, naked to the waist, save for my baggy purple shirt. What was it, I mean purple? Across the car park in stocking feet. A kaleidoscopic image of a hospital foyer with nurses, wheelchairs and geriatrics. I crawled across the floor, lost, recovered sufficiently to be led to a white windowless room, where I lay on a mattress in one corner until help arrived, and a cursory examination pronounced me saved, and I again entered the world of the living. Friday, February the 22nd, 1985. Pages be witness, another week like all the rest. Days squandered in self-perpetuating torment at my spineless existence. Eyeless, brainless, no thought, no future, no work. I'm driven to the conclusion that desperate measures are all that can rescue me from the stinking pit of moment. And yet I'm simultaneously overwhelmed by the hopelessness of my case. I'm trying hard not to use words inappropriately. I don't want to exaggerate, distort, or paint an inaccurate picture, and I appreciate how easy it is to let dramatic words and phrases swim into mind's view. And yet, my plight is serious. The incidental moments and passing frames of mind have, with neglect, blurred now into an indistinct ribbon of interminable afternoons and nights. It's impossible for me to pick out specific instances and dwell on them in my usual fashion. The particulars have gone, and all I'm left with are the generalities. And as my life, in general, has no structure or purpose at the moment, I've got little to write about other than my work and housing situation. I feel like I'll never regain what's been lost, so I'm writing in an effort to escape this claustrophobic sense of self. But in turning to words for relief, I find only undisciplined thinking and a suffocating limited vocabulary. As long as I live, I'll never overcome this dissatisfaction with words, words, words. I'll look back from some vantage point in the future and laugh. I'm merely a Pseud, nothing more. What was I really expecting? Thursday, July the 3rd, 2014. I sit in a carpet warehouse turned Zen temple in Toledo, Ohio, and the wind moves the trees outside, and my mind moves inside, not one, but still two, sadly, and the leaves turn their faces, now their backs, a flicker of grey and green that whispers, sit still, shut up, pay attention. Something miraculous may happen, or not. Nothing is for certain. Sit still, move without a trace. This is the way of the Buddhas. But I cling to grasses like a ghost, and wonder and worry and fret and hunger, and write my words in these pages, endless yeses and nos, picking and choosing until death or disaster will shut me up for good. My head is a forest of thoughts, of leaves, flickering green, now grey, a rustle, a roar. The world continues on. The movable backdrop shifts and changes. Thank you. We have some time for questions, if that even is appropriate. What the hell are you thinking?
How do you imagine turning this into, I mean, or do you imagine? Where is it going to
I mean, there's 503,000 words. I can't, I bought Scrivener and I loaded everything in there, and that tells me I have 503,000 words. I've divided those 500,000 words into those 7 chapters. And what I'm trying to do is reduce them down to about 100,000. But what it necessitates, of course, is rereading 5 years of my existence and trying to figure out things like narrative arcs, and character development. I'm not a creative writer by trade at all, so that's something I've never even tried to do before. Recently, I don't know if you're familiar with Laura Oldfield Ford's work. She's a graphic artist. In the 90s, she had a zine called Savage Messiah. And really it's a combination of images and text that reflect on basically what neoliberalism has done to England. And so that gave me the idea of possibly turning, unfortunately I don't have any slides here, but turning the whole thing kind of into a zine.
or graphic novels?
Graphic novels.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Did you draw?
So I drew these.
Those are great.
So I'll pass these around
Yeah.
if you're interested. So that's one possibility, but again, I mean, I'll probably be doing this when I'm 80 years old. Finish it.
Well, who's that guy from Norway who wrote My Struggle or what?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
I
it's
know
like
what you
this
mean.
interminable memoir.
Interminable memoir that just records literally everything.
Yes, yeah.
So,
I think the graphics really add to it, and the multiple layers
yeah.
really, I mean, I think it holds together.
But the trick, of course, is translating that into a book format.
Yeah,
So, I mean, that would be one way to do that.
it's great,
I've even thought of, doing some like kind of stand-up routine.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
mere Pseud.
yeah. Yeah.
Have you checked out any of Stephen Foll's work? Who's a sociologist at least he used to be at Boston College.
No.
He does this sort of, well, he's a performance artist and does this sort of collage style writing that
Okay.
that might, I mean, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not, but it might be like inspirational
Yeah,
for.
good idea. Yeah, I mean, this semester off has just been wonderful, and again, it's great that the ICS has given me this opportunity, but I mean, I spent maybe the first 4 weeks just thinking, what on earth am I trying to do here? I don't even know how to do this. It's just this huge project, and it's my life, so it's been very and you probably saw there at the end. I mean, it's
Yeah.
very intense,
Oh, yeah.
kind of revisiting all this stuff. And one of the best ways I found to kind of keep that at bay is by creating this character of the Pseud,
Right.
who is not me, but me.
Yeah.
You know, kind of abstracting it in that way. And it helps that it's this fictionalized place that doesn't really exist, even though it's based actually on Bradford, my hometown.
I also wanted to say this was awesome. I really enjoyed
Yeah,
it.
Oh, good.
it was
I
great.
can say that.
I appreciate it.
Sort of spellbinding, you know,
Rain Man.
really.
Any other comments or questions?
It just so happens that I'm reading Policing the Crisis with my students this week.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just, yeah, I mean, just.
Yeah, I mean, my brother Robert, he's Robert in the text. He taught at a comprehensive school in South Yorkshire, and 90% of his students' fathers were miners. So all through the miners' strike, I was visiting his house, just on the bus going by these serried ranks of miners and policemen duking it out. And that was just the backdrop, really, to my obsessions about women and pants and the things that I was worrying about.
Bill, it seems like, I mean, the graphic novel, I think, is one wonderful way, but there's also, and I don't know anything about Scalar yet, Andy can speak to it probably more, but this is exactly the kind of project that something like Scalar with the
digital
multimedia,
media.
yeah, as well as the
Yeah.
text.
Yeah, I mean, there is that
It's
too, which
for.
I haven't even really considered
So-
yet.
I actually want to kind of go against the grain and just say that I think you're a good enough writer where it's clear that you are a writer.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
nothing wrong with just writing it because you've already written it
Yeah,
and that's your medium. So
Yeah.
I feel like that's fine. There's nothing wrong with
the Pseud.
a
happy
really
to hear you say.
good written product, you know. I don't think you should feel like it has to go into some like hip new format or something. Unless that, you know, if that's what you want, where you want to take it, that's good.
Well,
too.
I've relaunched the blog, and now, of course, the calendar has decreed that now, 35 years after the events, the days of the week and the dates match up again. So now I relaunched the blog at the beginning of this semester. Today is March the 24th, 1981. So if you're interested, you can see my life unfolding in this dreary, unspectacular, anxious reality.
Compared to our spectacular.
Pseud even has his own Twitter account.
Well, I agree with Rob, you are a writer, but it's almost as if it could easily appear in multiple mediums because there's all these different levels. I mean, this is one level, the graphic and the text together, but then all of this plus the performance plus the
And that,
text.
quite frankly, has been the difficulty. Is it kind of works on all of these different registers. Plus, there's the kind of the critical historical stuff that I think works very well with it.
Yes.
But how to create some kind of coherent, if that's even a goal, some kind of thing.
I'm with Clayton.
That should be the goal, 'cause
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
what you're undoing.
yeah. We're all,
No.
you know, is that making it to try to shoehorn it into a coherent one single narrative would defeat many of the wonderful things
Yeah.
that are going on here and the different layers and parallels of the two different times, along with these other scales of history and meaning. That I think that's one of the wonderful things about all these different layers that can exist either on their own or in relationship to each other.
Yeah,
That's just my take.
Because I mean, it's you know, I said in my proposal, it's like E.P. Thompson meets the young ones. You know? It's like social history on
Yeah.
one level,
Yeah.
and it's just
But when
ridiculous on another.
Right. I want to say, you know, when you said that thing, I thought about exactly the line who said, according to Marx, my dad is a lackey, which is actually all our scholarship since then is just commentary on that one line. I'm thinking metaphorically, right? So.
And I
I guess the mere Pseud lives on because I haven't yet to tell my parents that I've even been working on it. They live on in blissful ignorance in the same house that I lived in back then. My brother's coming to visit this summer, so maybe I'll broach the subject. I'll probably be not very flattered at the portrait of him that emerges in his pages.
Bill, I'm curious about the arc itself, and it sounds like you're still kind of grappling with it too. But one of the things that struck me was when you jumped at the end to 2014, had this kind of wonderful jarring effect to it. And I'm curious if that's something that you're investigating in this, or if you're really keeping it to those early entries in the 80s, or you don't know.
Well, I don't really know. I mean, I've played around with that. I try and write every day, and I have been doing now since summer of 2013. I mean, I've amassed another huge archive of close to 250,000 words of just stuff that I write, you know. So that came from that trove of things. I mean, it's a good question, you know. It would be great to have another year off to explore that.
Sorry, I just made things harder.
Yeah. Because I do like the kind of the juxtapositional shifts between past and present. Because it was something at the time I was acutely conscious of. It's something I mean, on a kind of a scholarly level, I'm really interested in everyday life studies and all that kind of quotidian and all that stuff. And I think it comes from this. I've always just been fascinated by that. I mean, just the ordinary and the extraordinary all wrapped together, right, in these passing moments. I don't know why I find it so fascinating, but I just do. And so this really was an attempt. As I said at the beginning, I think I expected, and now of course I'm wiser, right, and I know this isn't a possibility really, but I really expected that if I recorded enough details in enough detail, that something would be revealed to me, some kind of pattern. It's almost like kind of a hex, you know, just got to figure out the significance. If you're familiar with the British writer Ian Sinclair, who's associated with psychogeography, he's famous for writing these weird kind of occult accounts of walking through London and connecting up all these churchyards and making all these weird arcane connections. And kind of a version of that was going on back then, although that only became clear to me as I reread them, quite what my mother made of them, I mean. She had the good sense not to continue reading.
You talked at one point about writing in the journal dutifully for a while and then skipping a large amount of time and having to go back and trying to reconstruct what that gap. Does that happen very often in the
Towards the end, it happens more frequently. I mean, I write every single day for the whole thing covers about 4 years and 7 months. And I write every single day for about the first half of that. And then I allow myself in this kind of OCD way I allowed myself to skip the occasional day. And then those days would become 2 or 3 and then sometimes a week. And then being 21, I would do speed and then write tons and tons of pages and try and catch up, stupid things like that. But that was part of that's why eventually I stopped writing, is because I kind of wrote myself into this situation where I couldn't get out of this paradox. This is a diary, and what you do with the diary is you record the details of every single day. But really what I wanted to be was a writer. And I didn't know how to get out of that paradox. And so eventually that became enough of a paradox that it shut me up. I just stopped doing it because I couldn't figure out how to not keep recording the days. Maybe I am just mentally ill. I don't know.
I just wonder how much of the project also is about memory.
Yeah.
The reliability of memory. I mean, because is this a memoir? Is it a history?
Well,
is it
it's
many things.
all of those and none of them, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, my friends love it because, of course, what it does is it gives them back their college days in extraordinary extraordinary detail.
And you said it's obviously a very personal thing, you know, and that's emotionally,
Yeah.
you've invested a lot in this, and going back and reading it, I'm sure is an emotional, a lot of emotional work. How much, if at all, have you changed things? I know you fictionalize like Watermouth, right, and all of those things.
Yeah.
And I know you have this detailed index about what everything really is versus what it is.
I've
In this
smoothed
version.
out, in places, smoothed out some of the syntax and removed some of the repetitious phrases and just kind of cleaned it up and made it read a little bit more smoothly. But I tried, when I did that, to be very, I wanted to maintain a kind of a fidelity to the original voice. So, and some of it's quite frankly just mortifyingly embarrassing. You know,
Well, I just wondered
obviously.
how hard it is for you to not do that kind of editing, and I wonder.
Well, I mean, it's easy insofar as all of the people involved are still alive. They have lives and families and careers, and there are acts of criminality. And, you know, we used to do, you know, break into shops and steal things and take lots of drugs and do other things, you know, which I'm sure they probably don't want to be associated with. So some of the details I deliberately fudged, just because they kind of make it shocking sometimes. I was 20 years old. Under this delusion that I was looking for something. No limits. But generally, I try and maintain fidelity. So, I mean, it's a very weird experience. I've noticed as I've been doing it, my original memory of the experiences has become supplanted by the actual narrative, which is kind
I
of
wondered about.
odd.
Yeah.
Which is kind of an odd experience. Which makes me feel crazy. Did any of this really happen?
Phil, are you familiar with Mortified? It's a performance series that started in Los Angeles about 5 or 6 years ago, where people of our generation read their childhood
Oh, yeah.
journals,
Oh, I've got some good
Yeah,
moments
public
that work
forum.
very well.
and now there's a Mortified band that sort of plays songs on school instruments as they sort of as interludes. So,
Mortifying.
there's a documentary that came out a year or two ago that was on Netflix for a while called Mortified. That's interesting.
I think there's a podcast.
Yeah.
I'll have to check it out. So if you want to read the blog, you know, send me an email and I'll send you the link. My life continues. The backdrop shifts and changes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.